The next question is from Hansford Rowe. I can't see you here unless you're under a different name, but I shall read the question out. So Hansford's question is, are there errors particular to the right hemisphere? Is it always willing, for example? And how is it that it relinquishes its role as master?
Yes, a good testing question. There are possible errors certainly associated with the right hemisphere, and one is its role in depression, in that it is more realistic than the left hemisphere, but it is also not entirely realistic. It tends to be slightly more pessimistic, if you like, or more fatalistic and pessimistic than perhaps the situation would require, but it's infinitely closer to the reality than the ludicrously optimistic left hemisphere. So that is one of its weaknesses. On the other hand, I'm loath to call depression, even though I know how cruelly it causes suffering, both from the experience of my patients and from myself. I'm loath to call it an entirely negative entity, and it may be that some kind of suffering of this kind is actually importantly productive. So it all depends. Is it too willing? Yes and no. It's more open than the left hemisphere. The left hemisphere is much more dogmatic, much more closed-minded. The left hemisphere is open-minded, but not absurdly so. In fact, it is more skeptical than the left hemisphere. So as Ramachandran says, the right hemisphere is the devil's advocate, which is saying it may look like this to you, but it might be otherwise. So the right hemisphere has a bigger role in inhibition than the left hemisphere, which surprises some people, especially if you buy the old wrong sort of hippie-like vision of the right hemisphere as the one that lets it all hang out, man. No, the right hemisphere, being much more morally responsible, much more in touch with reality than the left, is also more cautious, more willing to put different points of view and to inhibit the immediate response in case it's actually quite misleading. So generally speaking, I wouldn't say it's overwilling. I think it's rescuer from the left hemisphere's tendency to run headlong into things. Again, this is the exact opposite of the bad old pop psychology thing that the left hemisphere was, reliable and a bit cautious, boring perhaps, but the right hemisphere was impulsive. Well, no, the right hemisphere is not impulsive. The left hemisphere is the one that rushes in where angels fear to tread. And I think that's probably the main thing to say. And then I'd come to your second question. Why does it relinquish its role as master? Well, this is a very, very interesting point, and it's a rather profound one. And if you'll forgive me, I'll answer it in a somewhat perfunctory way, but point anyone who's interested in reading more where to read. And those places are the very end of the last chapter of The Master and His Emissary, where I talk about the need of the right hemisphere to make itself vulnerable, even though it knows that its trust may be taken advantage of, and that in this it's like the story of Paradise Lost, that a greater power makes itself vulnerable to a lower, less intelligent power because something needs that to happen, even though it risks the other less intelligent, more willful power acting against its better interest and against both their better interests. And of course, it's in the story of the Master and his emissary that it has to trust. It can't be the single thing. And I suppose if you think about this in terms of a religious tradition, whether it's Christian or not, certainly from my knowledge of the Kabbalah, it's very similar. The primary whatever it is, Ein Sof, God, love in Buddhism, whatever it is that is the core, needs an other of some kind. It can't simply be completely self-contained and refer only to itself, because it is relational. Love is relational. And if it's not relational to some other free being, it's not love. And so there is this necessity to allow freedom. And freedom, the necessity for both order and freedom, not too much order or chaos is another theme that runs right the way through my work and comes up again and again in different contexts, in physics, in philosophy, in the relationship between the hemispheres. This need for the flexibility, and there is always a vulnerability built into it. And I don't think it would be better if there wasn't a vulnerability. Because if there wasn't a vulnerability, it would simply be the triumph of power. And power, as you know, is the aim, the besetting sin of the left hemisphere. And religions that are based on this rather left hemisphere, rigid, dogmatic point of view, usually have a God who is effectively an all-powerful tyrant or an engineer that is keeping a mechanism going and knows all the answers already. Well, I argue at enormous length, I'm afraid, in chapter 28 for a God that is, or a divine entity, spirit, whatever you like to call it, the sacred core of things, as being not of this nature, that it allows freedom even in its own despite. So that's the best I can say quickly, really.
Beautiful. Thank you, Ian. And a great question.